Okay, everyone, welcome to World Autism Awareness Week. This is the final talk. I'm Oliver Carmichael, or Olly as people call me, and I was asked to give a talk on what it is to be me and what it is to be on the autistic spectrum, particularly in relation to what it is to be on the autistic spectrum and not know you're on the spectrum compared to them being diagnosed, and how that can change your life. Because I'm 27 now, but I wasn't actually diagnosed until I was 25, which is quite a late diagnosis. So one of the things I've tried to do, or there's two things I've tried to do with this talk, and the first is to sort of make it a little bit of a journey into understanding, to try and capture the journey into understanding that I and those people who've known me have been on over the past 2 years since my diagnosis. And I've also tried to make it sort of a little bit of a sensory experience. So I've tried to incorporate some of the senses into the talk, because one of the biggest things that came out of my diagnosis was discovering that as somebody with autism, I have a different brain experience and a different sensory experience of the world compared to the majority of neurotypical people. So I'm very hypersensitive to everything. I feel things in my body. I feel things very physically, particularly in my digestive system, which is potentially one of the reasons why when I was about 13, 14 years old, I developed an eating disorder. So one of the first things probably to know about me is that I was actually an inpatient on Naomi, which is the retreats. It's the unit that deals specifically with eating disorders. I was admitted 2 years ago in March. I was there for 15 months and I was eventually discharged last June. And this was actually my second hospital admission for my eating disorder. My first hospital admission also lasted 15 months. It was in a different hospital, and it was nothing short of traumatic and very nearly soul destroying. It left me with severe PTSD. But my experience in Naomi was very different, and I think one of the reasons it was really different and one of the reasons that it helped me step into recovery from my eating disorder was that during my admission we found the key to understanding me. And I guess that's what I'm going to be talking about today. But just to begin with, I'm going to share some apparently random facts about me with you. So, I have gender dysphoria. For anybody who doesn't know, that's when somebody is born and their gender identity, they feel their gender identity does not match with their biological sex. So I was born in a female body, but I definitely have a male brain. It's not an illness, it's not a disorder, it's just a sort of biological mishap, if you will. I've had a lactose intolerance since birth. I love stories and writing and have a degree in English literature and creative writing. I've always loved sport. I've always been a mover, and as a child I really liked a good rough and tumble. And I have what I call a sort of spidey sense of smell. So if we have a 3-story house, if I'm in the attic and my mum is cutting cucumber, in the kitchen I can smell the cucumber being cut. And I also have a fascination with car number plates. So I'm now going to share a song with you. And while I play the song, I just want you to think about what this song makes you feel, what does it remind you of, just what sort of experience does it give you in your body. And for anybody who thinks I just can't stand that song, I'm not going to play it for too long, so don't worry. Okay, I hope everyone can hear that right at the back. That song is by Skrillex and it's called Bangarang. Does anyone want to offer up what that song makes them think or feel? Yeah, just shout out.
My boyfriend loves Skrillex, so it made me think of my boyfriend.
Okay. When I first heard that song, I said to the people I was with, I said, that's exactly what it's like in my head. And I think nowadays it's not like that in my head all the time. It's like that if something has really ruffled my autism, or if the world is just really confusing to me, that's what it's like. But when I was admitted to Naomi 2 years ago, that's pretty much what it was like in my head all the time. At that point in my life, I'd already been receiving therapy for about 10 years, and I'd say that the experience of digging so intensely and for such a length of time into your own head is in itself a bit of a challenge to your mental health. And I just felt like the more I dug into my head and into my mind, sort of my emotions and my past, the more fragmented and unstable my mental health had become. And I think this is pretty well illustrated by some extracts from this, which is my 2013 page-a-day diary. And I think looking at the extracts, what they really sum up is just how tormented, how disturbed I was, what a narrow range of emotions I had, and how incoherent my sense of self was. So I'm not sure how clear the slides are, but I was always questioning, always ruminating and puzzling at questions all the time. So who am I and why has this happened was something that I was constantly asking myself. I wrote about the torture and self-hate, the guilt and the shame and the dissatisfaction, the defiance of those who loved and cared for me, the need to be ill, to suffer, to get love, and the love that never felt enough. I questioned, did I just imagine myself a boy? I felt anger and distress, sadness and loss, grief and loneliness, hurt and confusion. I felt like I had a fragmented sense of self, that my brain was all tangled, and I was just like this chaos of absolute feelings. And most of my day was spent just ruminating over all this, and I think that was definitely made worse by the level of anxiety I was experiencing at that point in my life, which was really just all-consuming, and was definitely made worse by, one, the PTSD I was suffering from the first hospital admission, but also as well by my weight, which at that point was probably about 4.5 stone. So when I came to Naomi, I couldn't really have been much iller, and I really felt like I dug to a point where we peeled back all these layers in therapy, and what I was left with was a box. And I had this sort of sense that what was in the box was what was really disturbing my psychological well-being. And I'd sort of managed to peek in the box and sort of being able to communicate what was in there, but any time, it was kind of impossible for us to properly open the box and explore what was in there, because every time we did, I think one of the posters I wrote that I stuck up in my room, Naomi, perfectly expresses that hell hath no fury like an eating disorder. And to me, it was like every time we tried to open the box, we were just met by a very angry eating disorder, and by this sort of explosion of uncontained emotion. And that emotion proved to me to be very overwhelming. It proved to those who were trying to help me to be very daunting. And it brought about some really disruptive and some really challenging behaviour. So examples of my behaviour, I would have panic attacks around food. I often headbanged and punched the walls. I would attack some of the retreat foliage. I broke windows. I smeared food all around the dining room. I would shut myself in my room and pace figures of 8 to try and control just like this constant anxiety and all these emotions that I just had no way of expressing. I spent most of the first 3 or 4 months of my admission either screaming, crying, and just with huge amounts of aggression and anger. And when I look back on it now, I think the reason I exhibited, so much of these behaviours was because I had no other way of really expressing or coping with what I was feeling. I think some of the posters I stuck up in my room, that this was about one of the few ways I had of trying to express how I felt and what I was experiencing. And they sum up pretty well what I was experiencing. So I felt raw, sore and exhausted. I felt like my insides were being ripped up by the pain. often I felt a bit like a firework that really had to be handled with care. I just felt like I was constantly on the edge of exploding. I wrote about the food, that I didn't want it in me, that I felt it was disgusting, it was sickly, sweetness of it all, the taste, the texture, the unpleasant experience of eating. I definitely wanted out of my body. I felt quite often like I wished it was sort of like there was a zip and I could unzip it and just crawl out and not actually have to be in a body. I felt a little bit like I'd fallen down the borderline between fantasy and reality, and like I was hovering on the dangerous edge of things. And finally, there was this question that was always tormenting me, which was, what if I was nothing more than the sum of my illness? So and I think for the first 4 or 5 months of my mission on Naomi, what I and the staff there were really faced with was a lack of understanding. My behaviours didn't make sense to those who were caring for me. Although some of my behaviour was eating disordered, a lot of it was not consistent with having an eating disorder. I'd also in the past been labelled as having borderline personality disorder, but a lot of my behaviour didn't really add up to that diagnosis either. I definitely didn't understand why I was acting like this and often felt like I had no control. So it felt like I had no control over the anger, no control over needing to hurt myself. And I definitely didn't understand the place I'd found myself in, because Naomi works on the basis of a therapeutic community. And to suddenly find myself living around all these people, being asked to talk about my feelings, listen to how they felt and why we were all behaving like we did, was just incredibly overwhelming for me. What all this led to eventually was it sort of culminated on June the 7th when I ran away from Naomi, and I was eventually picked up in the evening by the police. And that was a Friday night, and on the Monday I went into my multidisciplinary team meeting, and it had to be one of the worst moments of my mission. I was told I was uncompassionate, that I was not complying, that I was just not being cooperative with the staff, that my behaviour was completely disrupting the unit and causing a lot of distress for other patients. And after the meeting, Julia Coates, who was my therapist, came to my room and she said to me that if I didn't turn things around and start to try and do something about the situation I got myself into, then they were either looking at transferring me to another eating disorders ward or sending me to an acute unit. And I think it was that word acute unit that really made me think I had to do something, because I knew if I ended up on an acute unit, there was no way I was going to get some of the specialist help that I felt I needed. So I arranged a meeting with Dr. Andrea Bown, who's the consultant psychiatrist on Naomi. And I said to her, well, I think first of all, I think I'm just absolutely exhausted with everything. So I suggested to her that try to sort of, alleviate some of this and try and salvage the situation, that I go on bed rest. And so I began 19 days of self-inflicted bed rest. And one of the things I was encouraged to try and do while on bed rest was to build a distress tolerance box. And for anyone who doesn't know what a distress tolerance box is, it is a box, and it can be a shoe box or anything, and you are asked to put things into the box that will remind you of what to do when you are struggling. So quite often people with eating disorders and other mental illnesses will use what we call behaviours to help them cope with their feelings. And behaviours, they tend to be quite harmful to the individual, maybe harmful to other people. They are therapy interfering, and they kind of prevent your recovery. So what you're asked to do is trade your behaviours for skills, and skills are ways of coping with emotions that are not detrimental. So into a box, people put all sorts of things. Some people I know put a yo-yo or distress tolerance toys, so something to play with their hands. Some people put puzzle books so they can do puzzles when they're struggling. Other people put their mum's perfume, their teddy bear, whatever, anything that reminds them of something to do that is positive and a skill to use. And it's safe to say at that point my distress tolerance box was pretty sparse. So one thing I did know, there was a couple of things I did have in there and I did know did help me. And one of the things, particularly when I was really close to just feeling like I was going to burst, was showers. So I think on Naomi, the first like 4 or 5 months, I must have had about 4 or 5 showers a day. And so I had my showers, and particularly if it was like a sort of like citrusy shower gel, that really helped as well. I also knew that music really, really helped. I had my writing, so I wrote all my posters. And then there was another thing, and I don't have anything in the box, so I'm not really sure how you depict this. But one of the things that was noticed by the staff was if I was really distressed and another patient came in and hugged me, then I immediately de-escalated, and quite often all the anger and all the aggression just dissipated into tears. And it was this concept of the hug that proved to be a sort of missing connection to understanding what was going on. So I remember on the 1st of July, I was sat in my bedroom and Andrea came to me and she said that she'd spent the weekend at the Autism Roadshow and she'd been talking to a physiotherapist there. And this physio specialised in helping children in the autistic spectrum, and she had a whole load of sensory equipment with her. And one of the things she had was like a human mangler, basically. So people pushed themselves between 2 rollers, and what she said was that some people with autism really responded very well to pressure, particularly when they were on the point of sensory overload or on the point of what's known as meltdown. And this, Andrea said, as she was talking to me, the first thing I thought about was you and this need you have for a hug when you get to the point where you're gonna like just have a meltdown. So she said, I think it's a possibility that the thing we're missing is that you might actually be autistic. And once she told me this, I related the story back to her. About 5 years prior to that, I had heard a small article on the radio, and there was a group of researchers who were looking at the possibility that some people who had eating disorders that were not responding to any type of therapy might actually have autism. So she said it was worth us doing the sort of the questionnaires and the assessment just to see if I did have autism. So this took place over a series of weeks in which I had to do certain interviews with her, certain questionnaires. She also did about 4 or 5 hour assessment with my parents. And at this point, I didn't really know anything about autism beyond the fact that there was a book out there called The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Middle of the Night. I didn't know anything. But as we did the assessment, she began to explain to me certain behaviours, traits and problems that people with autism have. And it was as she was speaking to me, I felt like for the first time, somebody was talking to me in a way that made complete sense. So she talked to me about how many people have sensory sensitivities. They can be very hypersensitive, but they can also be very hyposensitive. How there's usually an awful lot of anxiety when people have autism. She also explained how one of the traits is a fascination with strings of information, which really explained why I have this fascination with car number plates. She also talked about the problems with social interaction and empathy, about the need for routines, about how therefore Naomi was a really challenging environment because although Naomi is very structured, it's open to change at any possible moment if there is a crisis going on with a particular patient. We also had groups, so we were expected to sit in these groups where there's all these people and you're expected to talk about yourself, but the group might run over, which to me, I don't like that. Things have to be on time, things need to stick to their routine. It also explained why I had this sort of real emotional distance to other people. Quite often I'd sit there and think, are they really feeling that? Can they really be feeling that? I just quite often thought they were lying. Actually, that they were lying about their feelings. They were lying about their feelings towards other people because I couldn't understand why they were having this emotional reaction to other people. And it really explained why I was constantly on the verge of sensory overload all the time when I was on Naomi. And I think So sensory overload often leads to somebody having a meltdown, and I think for the first 3 or 4 months, I probably had 4 or 5 meltdowns a day. In fact, some days it just felt like I was having one long continuous meltdown. And this sort of proved to be a bit of a turning point, because the more she talked about autism and the more I began to understand that, the more I began to feel like I was understanding myself, and the more in control of everything I began to feel. And it sort of really closed the gap between me and, at that time, the staff, because it counted so much for my behaviour. And on July the 17th, she came to me and she said, "You do score as autistic," and she diagnosed me with Asperger's. Although I think that has kind of been done away with now, and it's now referred to as high-functioning autism without language difficulties, I think is what it is now. And what that diagnosis did was it reframed everything, and that reframing was the key to being able to open the box, because what it meant was that we realised what was sort of coming out the box, what we're being met with every time we try and opened it, was not some force that was trying to stop us from getting in the box. It was actually just part of the box. So my difficulty with emotion regulation, my need to constantly move, my self-injurious behaviour, and my restricted and avoidant food intake were all just features of my autism. And I think one of the most enlightening pieces of work I did, underpinning my autism, which was really the missing part of some sort of jigsaw that we were trying to figure out. Underpinning that was really just all anxiety. One of the most enlightening pieces of work I actually did with Andrea during that period was on my sensory profile, which looks like this. And what your sensory profile is, it's a very long questionnaire composed of hundreds of questions. And it rates you on your 5 senses, along with your balance and your sort of sense of movement. And once the questionnaire is completed, Andrea ranked up the scores and then gave me the rainbow, and I coloured in the rainbow. So I think it's like this is vision, this is hearing, this is taste, and it goes through them all. And when Andrea came, once I'd coloured it in, Andrea came to me and she said she was quite shocked, because although the profile gives some examples, and quite often people are hypersensitive in usually 1 or 2 senses, but she said she was really quite shocked by how hypersensitive I was in so many different senses, particularly in those relating to taste, texture and smell, which of course would then result in the reason why I can smell cucumber 3 floors up, and the reason why I had such a difficulty with food and with eating. And in light of this, they made one of the first reasonable adjustments to the Naomi program for me. And that involved a meeting with the dietitian, Annette Cogfield. And we sort of sat down and reevaluated my relationship with food in light of my sensory experience. And we sort of realised as I was doing this that most of my life I'd never really had a very positive experience of food. It had been pretty negative. I grew up in a house where the food on your plate was the food that you ate, and if you didn't eat it, you went hungry. So I just got on and ate my food, but my experience of doing so was often very distressing. You know, there was these tastes and textures I didn't like. I remember sitting at school being asked to eat a tuna fish sandwich, which was the most nauseating experience ever. To me, eating mince is like eating worms. So quite often I found food very distressing, very intolerable, but I just assumed that this is what food was like for everybody. So I just kept quiet, ate my food. And Annette said to me, she said, well, I want to be the first person who gives you an enjoyable experience of food. So she asked me to create a massive map of everything to do with all the different types of food, proteins, carbs, fat, and how I responded to them, not from an eating disorder point of view, but from a sort of textural taste point of view. We drew up this map, and then they did something quite radical for Naomi. And on Naomi, everybody has a meal plan that is individual to themselves, but it's based upon general guidelines and boundaries that Annette and her team produced. And they sort of wrote this all off for me, and we came up with a completely new meal plan. And it was one that was based on the map, based on food I could tolerate, and it meant that actually I was going to have to self-cater an awful lot of my meals. And when we put this into place, it really brought it was like a sigh of relief, because it meant that for the first time in my life I was eating food that actually I found all right and wasn't being told I had to eat. But it also gave me a lot of freedom, because one of the things about needing to restore the amount of weight that I needed to restore, quite often with high diets that need a high energy intake, they fortify them with lactose and with dairy. And I couldn't have lactose or dairy, but I had a lot of weight to restore. I was also continually having all these meltdowns and all this anxiety, which was also burning up all the food, and we weren't really progressing a lot with my weight gain, even 6 or 7 months into my admission. So they said, go away and get creative in the kitchen with the ingredients that you like and find a way to fortify your diet in order to put on some weight. So I went away and I came up with what came to be known as Olly's outburst balls. Okay, and they basically were a combination of dates, nuts and coconut oil, and they were something I found okay. They were more pleasurable than the vast majority of things I've been asked to eat. And they packed an awful lot of energy into a very small form. So I'm going to pass them around. They do contain nuts. You are welcome to try them if you want to. And those were one of the key ways I eventually managed to get my body out of starvation. The other thing I believe about people on the autistic spectrum as well is that you don't just have a different sort of sensory experience of the world, you also have a different experience of your body. So I definitely think that I'm very aware of what goes on in my digestive system, probably far more aware than the average neurotypical person, which means that I concentrate an awful lot on my torso. And I think one of the things that I've spent some time really exploring, and was possibly one of the first things to go in my box, was the issue of milk. Because having a lactose intolerance from birth meant that my first experience of being fed and nourished was a painful and uncomfortable one. And that pain and the distress I was in as a baby, because I had a lactose intolerance, meant that it really hampered my parents' sort of physical ability to meet my physical and emotional needs, which arguably is one of the precursors to my eating disorder, because my experience of food has always been one of pain and discomfort, and therefore food to me is a plate of anxiety. It's also one of the parts of the puzzle that really interests me and which I spent a lot of time thinking about, because there's a lot of growing evidence between autism and gastrointestinal problems, and I really do believe there is like a real gut-brain connection. Because one of the things that used to really distress me on Naomi, and which I used to find really confusing and which I couldn't figure out why, was one day I'd be fine and the next day I'd have a complete mood and energy swing. I'd be fatigued, I'd feel irritable, I'd be angry, I'd feel depressed, I'd feel like I was walking around with my brain just in a fog. And I couldn't really work out, there seemed to be no rhyme or reason to this, but I did know on those days where I felt more irritable, more tired, more lethargic, I was also more likely to have a meltdown. And I also experienced some real discomfort centered around my abdomen. And at first, everybody thought that it was just some sort of body distortion thing that I was going through. But the more I talked about it and the more I explored it with staff, the more we began to realize that actually maybe it was just IBS. And So again, I met with a dietitian, and she said, try a low residue diet. And what actually happened was, in trying a low residue diet, I significantly dropped the amount of gluten there was in my diet. And it wasn't until somebody pointed out weeks later how well I was doing managing my outbursts that I thought, but I haven't needed to manage my outbursts because I haven't been anywhere near having another meltdown or another outburst. And it was then that I realised that actually my cognitive function had drastically improved. I was no longer nowhere near as angry and irritable, and the only thing I'd done was drop gluten from my diet. And since coming out of hospital, I've dropped gluten and all dairy out my diet, and I definitely have been pretty much outburst free thanks to that. And if I do come across anything that has upsets my gut, then, or I think I've eaten something, I know about it because I am more irritable, I am more fatigued, I am more likely to display more autistic behaviour, for want of a better way of putting it. But at that time, the ability to actually become pretty much outburst and meltdown free was incredibly liberating, because I'd spent the past year, 2 years, just absolutely dominated by these things that dominated my day. And they'd really hampered my recovery because they were incredibly isolating. They were isolating because my way of dealing with it to begin with was to shut myself in my room and just march a figure of 8. And it was also to isolate myself from too much stimulus. But on a place where you're expected to interact with the community, that's really not an option. And it meant that there was a distance between me and the community, but it also meant that when I had the meltdowns, there was a distance between me and the community as well, because my behaviour was so volatile, so threatening at times, it was unpredictable, it was aggressive, and it was quite often destructive. I never hurt another person, but I showed a lot of aggression towards myself and towards objects. One of the staff actually pointed out to me that she felt I was more likely to have outbursts if there was something I was trying to communicate but was unable to communicate. But the irony of that was that in having the outburst, I wasn't able to really communicate very well either. And it was the point at which I was able to sit down and tell the community that Andrea had done this, that I had Asperger's, that I was not out to harm them, that this was all part of being autistic, that I couldn't control my behaviour, but that I never intended to hurt anybody, that it really sort of became like this journey of like understanding and discovery for everyone, because once I told the community, all they wanted to do was just be able to help me. And one of the biggest ways they were able to help me was just to accept me as part of their community, because one of the things Andrew said to me was that although Naomi and the program was incredibly intense and very difficult for somebody with Asperger's or for autism, it was also an excellent opportunity because it provided me with like a little sort of microcosm on society. So it would allow me to observe, analyse and learn what it was like to be part of a group of people. So I could sort of begin to sort of learn some sort of social skills and try and like understand what it was not only for me to be autistic in a neurotypical world, but what it was for neurotypical people to have someone with autism in their world. And it was while I was sort of sat in the group one day thinking about this that I began to realise there was possibly a reason why I'd remained undiagnosed for so long, and that was that I'd actually developed my own way of navigating social skills. And that was due to my love of books and my love of stories. And I figured out that what I'd actually done was, over the years, all the stories, all the books, all the films I'd ever been exposed to, I'd sort of created a filing system in my head of characters and of scenarios and situations. And whenever and this had become my sort of frame of reference. And any time I was stuck in a situation where I just couldn't quite predict the situation, couldn't predict other people's behaviours, felt a little bit lost, wasn't really sure how I should act, And because I didn't really feel any empathy, so I didn't have any emotions sort of guiding me in how to act, I just felt confusion. What I would do, I would go to my little mental filing cabinet and I'd rifle through, and I'd find a character or a situation that fitted with the place I found myself in. And I'd act either how they had acted or how I felt they would have acted. And that was just the way I'd managed to navigate myself through the world for 25 years. So I like to say that I have like sort of an intellectual empathy rather than an emotional empathy. You know, I have to think about how to act, and I have to think about how other people are feeling. It doesn't come naturally. There's no sort of emotions guiding me there. And it was when I was discussing this with Julia that she started telling me about something called theory of mind. And I was like, well, what on earth theory of mind? And she said, well, I want you to read this book. And the book was called The Essential Difference by Simon Baron-Cohen. And I said to her, what's the book about? And she said, well, very simply, what it's about is he argues that the female brain is geared for empathizing, and the male brain is geared for systemizing. So the male brain likes to build and understand and is around logic, and the female brain is better at communicating, and that's very boiled down. And she said that what he argues in his book is that autism is not some sort of mental anomaly, it's actually just having an extreme male brain. And I sort of looked at it and I said, well, that's really interesting, Julia, given that I also have gender dysphoria. And it was like at that point that the final piece of the jigsaw, it was just laid out before us. Because my gender dysphoria, my lactose intolerance, my Asperger's, my need to move, my obsessions, some of my spidey senses, and my love of writing and stories and the need for fiction all sort of joined together at that moment, and everything sort of made sense. And while July was the month in which they diagnosed me with autism, August was the first month that I had my first appointment at Newcastle Gender Identity Clinic. And on the 13th of September, after discussion with staff, I sat in one of the groups in Naomi and I told the rest of the community about my gender dysphoria. I told them I wanted to be known as Olly and I wanted to be referred to as he. And I think at that point everybody was just like, oh, thank goodness, because this suddenly makes sense. I suddenly made sense to everybody, the combination of that and the gender dysphoria. And I really think that it was my diagnosis, along with my choice to live as male, that has enabled me to start to lead a recovered life. I've been out of Naomi about 9 months now. I started hormone replacement therapy about 5 months ago. And while there's days when my eating disorder is still quite loud, and while there's a lot of times when I still get very confused by the world, I'd say I am about 110% more comfortable with myself and with my place in the world than I was 2 years ago. But I know that that's really because I was lucky enough to find myself in a place where the staff and the community really sort of believed in Olly and in the power of understanding him. So I'd say like a diagnosis, whether it comes in childhood or in adulthood, brings about an understanding, and that understanding not only helps bridge the gap between the sort of neurotypical world and autism, but it can completely alter the course of an individual's life and even save their life. So that's my story. I am available for anybody to ask questions if you want to ask questions now. If not, or if you go away and you think, oh, I didn't ask that, I have an email address as well, and I am more than willing to communicate with anybody about anything, really, anything that I've talked about today. But if anybody has any questions now, I quite happily take them. No? Okay, if not, I have an email address, okay. But thank you very much for turning up, for supporting this week and for listening.
Thank you, Olly.